It's Friday, September 19th, 2025. Welcome to Make It Make Sense. I'm Granthermes. What a week it has been in American politics. And the way that I've been talking about it with people that I talk to in my daily life is it does feel like we have sort of crossed a threshold here into something new. The death of Charlie Kirk, what happened over the weekend, attacks on liberal ideology and those groups, attacks on just being a Democrat, attacks on people, calls from the government for private businesses to retaliate against their employees for using their freedom of speech outside of work. And that came to a head late this week with the indefinite suspension / firing ? Of Jimmy Kimmel from ABC after, as reported by Rolling Stone, ABC, Disney, and even local affiliate officials didn't find anything wrong with what Kimmel said, but were worried about retaliation from the government. And as all of that happened just over the last 8 days at this point, and that's all it has been, it feels like a lot longer, there have been a lot of conversations about authoritarianism, the U.S. sliding into authoritarianism, something that I've talked a lot about here on this show, and really why we aren't good at explaining that. It's why my guest today is Karrin Anderson. She's a professor at Colorado State University who studies this kind of political communication around things like gender and politics and authoritarianism and politics, and the way that, yes, the news talks about it, the way people like me talk about it, but also how we talk about it amongst ourselves and how to recognize the signs of what is, at this point, pretty clearly happening in America. And I know that sounds like a lot, but a lot is happening, and a lot is happening really fast right now. And it's important for us to recognize the signs so that we can stop things before they go too far. Before we get on with the episode, make sure you're following or subscribe to the show, whatever podcast app you listen to it on. Like, subscribe, hit the bell for notifications if you're a YouTube watcher. Sign up for the Make It Make Sense Substack, where I've got a brand new article up this week all about how we also aren't good at talking about online extremism and how people become radicalized online. Even though we know a whole lot about it, our leaders and most of us just aren't good at explaining how this happens, which means we aren't good at solving the problem. It's all in there, but it is for paid subscribers. It's just $5 a month to get access to that and all the other great articles I've got up on the Substack. And as always, share the show on social media. It's Mims Newspod. That's MIMS Newspod, all one word, on every platform. I am at Granthermes on Twitter and Bluesky, and at Granthermes TV on everything else. All right, let's get to the show. I try hard on Make It Make Sense to give you a complete picture of the biggest stories, but I'm only one guy, and staying up to date with events around the world can be difficult for anyone when it's impossible to consult a single source for the full story. And with our social media algorithms sending us the versions of the news that only reinforce our own biases, it can be hard to know if you're actually informed, even for me. And that's why I've been using Ground News. Ground News is an app and a website that combines news from around the world all in one place, so you can compare coverage from every news source, and you can see if they have a political bias, how reliable their reporting is, and who owns them. My favorite feature is the blind spot feed. It highlights news disproportionately covered by one side or the other, so I can make sure I know how the news is being covered. It's like Make It Make Sense for Make It Make Sense. Right now, if you subscribe through my link in the show notes, you get 40% off the Vantage subscription. It's the one I use to get unlimited access to every feature, and it is just $60 for the entire year or $5 a month when you use that link. Your subscription helps Make It Make Sense, too. We get a cut of this subscription, but you're also helping Ground News make the news more transparent. Again, use the code in the show notes to get 40% off your Vantage subscription to Ground News. All right. Let's get back to the show. Thank you so much for being here. I really appreciate it. I am a big fan of your work and your writing, so this is very exciting for me.
Thank you for having me, and I'm excited to be here.
So let's start with this idea of the United States slipping into competitive authoritarianism. Listeners who've listened to the show for a while will have heard other guests and heard me talk about this, but from your expertise, from where you sit, how close are we right now in the U.S. to that kind of a government?
Well, we have documented signs of competitive authoritarian all around us and in various sectors. We obviously have some constraining of the media. Large media corporations such as Paramount and CBS have made news decisions that relinquish some of their independence as a media organization. They settled a lawsuit that many experts thought that they certainly would have won when the Trump administration accused them of unfairly editing an interview during the 2024 campaign. And more recently, they just pledged, CBS News pledged not to edit interviews on Face the Nation at all. It's really unusual for a large media organization to give up its editorial independence to the government, or at least under threat of government response if they didn't. So that's really unusual. In other sectors, we've had a lot of journalists leave the Washington Post after the editorial owner, Jeff Bezos, announced that he was going to change the editorial focus of the paper. Now, there are many reporters that are still there. They're doing great independent journalism, but many other reporters, some of whom we had a Pulitzer Prize-winning editorial cartoonists, who felt that their work was being censored. That's disturbing. Another realm that I'm very familiar with is what's going on in higher education. The Trump administration has attempted to revoke, put a halt on, or otherwise withhold federal funds, both particularly federal grants that universities and scholars competitively applied for, pertained to studies on a wide range of subjects. And the withholding of those funds stops those studies, many of which, would have benefited the American people. And now the data, in some cases, is dead. Those actions were taken under the guise of responding to anti-Semitism on campus. But of course, a federal judge recently noted that she did not feel that justification held water, that it was credible. And so with competitive authoritarianism, we've got these sectors that were formerly independent and importantly vital sectors for maintaining democratic health, higher education, and journalism. And we're starting to see a loss of independence in those sectors, and that's really disturbing.
Walk me through the difference between competitive authoritarianism and authoritarianism as I think people think about it. We think about it in the 1900s, mid-century sort of sense of this thing of the Mussolinis, the Pol Pots, the Hitlers, but that's not exactly what this is. It's at least not the same thing, right?
It is not. So competitive authoritarianism is something that has been on the rise globally, particularly in Europe. Stephen Levitsky and Daniel Ziblatt wrote a book that How Democracy Dies, that documents the characteristics of competitive authoritarianism in a variety of countries in recent history, the last few decades. The way that it works is a competitive authoritarian rises through the democratic process and often wins elections, and it has, and other democratic institutions are functioning in society. But the difference with the competitive authoritarian is once in power, they change the rules of the game or undermine democratic norms and use those institutions that they are in charge of to actually tilt the playing field in their favor in future elections, as well as in, legal and institutional proceedings. And so the real key with competitive authoritarianism is twofold. There's not a broad commitment to democratic norms and upholding democratic norms, regardless of who's in office. It's a notion that, I want to stay in power and I'm going to use whatever levers I have at my disposal to do that. Whether that means changing the rules for my enemies, but not for me, or utilizing democratic institutions in ways that they aren't typically utilized to consolidate power. The one of the interesting things about competitive authoritarianism, in some ways, this is hopeful, and that is it's not a full totalitarian takeover of society. You still have democratic institutions that exist and are functioning. So, earlier I talked about some loss of journalistic independence at some media organizations. There's still many, many other journalistic organizations and outlets that are freely publishing stories, and those journalists have not yet been, thrown in jail. So democratic institutions still exist and still operate, but there is a willingness at the highest level to use democratic institutions against one's enemies or to consolidate your own power in anti-democratic ways.
I'm sort of thinking about this in the conversations that I've had on this show with other people and in the reporting that I've done about the redistricting fight that's happening in states across the country would seem to fall under some of that case of the rule changing. And then listeners, just last week, the conversation that I had with Liz Dye about the shadow docket on the Supreme Court and using this democratic function in a illiberal way. Would those things also track in this for you?
Absolutely. There are two sort of different cases because the Supreme Court is an independent entity, and the Supreme Court itself has been operating in ways that don't necessarily match the way that it has operated in earlier eras or that it has operated towards democratic presidents. So Donald Trump is getting some deference from the Supreme Court that Joe Biden and other Democratic presidents did not get. So that's sort of one example. But the redistricting example is a really good one. Typically, redistricting exercises take place after census data comes in, sort of on a regular, predictable basis. And the idea of redistricting, it's complicated, because it is legal under our current laws to redistrict in ways that advantage political parties. It is not legal to redistrict in ways that disadvantage people according to race or ethnicity. But because there's a lot of overlap in many states between people's race and ethnicity and people's party affiliation, it's sort of hard to say, well, is this being done legally or illegally with respect to those two rules. What isn't hard to say is that in the past, redistricting has been done on a regular, predictable basis using regular, predictable processes that don't change radically from cycle to cycle. What we, of course, had in the case of recent redistricting was, state that decided we're going to redistrict now so that we can change, influence the impact of the next election. And then we've got California Governor Gavin Newsom saying, well, if the Republicans are going to change the rules at this point, or the norms at least, then the Democrats, in order to stay on an even playing field, have to do the same. All right. Suddenly, what that means is we have a less democratic way of choosing, drawing the electoral map, because people are doing it specifically to influence the upcoming election, the people in power, as opposed to redistricting in a way that gives all of our voters an equal chance at having their views represented fairly in the election.
Right. The way that I've talked about this in the past with people like Andy Moore or Dave Daley is that it's politicians picking their people instead of the other way around, and that's inherently undemocratic. The other thing I wanted to talk to you about here, and I think this should be kind of the bulk of our conversation, is the communication inside a competitive authoritarian state, the demagoguery that we're seeing. And the word demagogue gets thrown around a lot, but it is, as you said, we were talking before I hit record here, is that it's not just one person, although I think the president is a uniquely singular politician that we've not seen in this country for a long time in this way, but it is an environment of these things. Can you walk me through that theory of this? Because I think that's really interesting and really important to understand.
I really can. And I want to direct your listeners and viewers to Patricia Roberts Miller's book, Demagoguery and Democracy. It's a short, very accessible book where she lays out this theory about the connections between a demagogic communication environment and the rise of the demagogue. She lays out what the characteristics of demagoguery are. Now, a lot of people, when they hear the word demagoguery, they think that, oh, it's just, a highly emotional speaker who can persuade people to do things they might not otherwise do. What Roberts Miller's book does is say that's actually not the way that scholars understand demagoguery. The way that scholars understand demagoguery is a communication environment where people are encouraged to scapegoat political enemies, and they are encouraged to the demagogues don't abide by mutually agreed upon rules of discourse and argumentation and persuasion. And those two things together, not relying on sort of shared conceptions of what facts are, a heavy reliance on logical fallacies, combined with scapegoating, that's really the stew that predisposes a society to being vulnerable to demagoguery. And when I say scapegoating, the way that works is you encourage a community to believe that all of the problems that they are experiencing can be solved if we just remove certain members of the community from the community. You put all of the onus of the problems on usually vulnerable members of society, and you say, okay, what we really need to do is not have a deliberation about these policy issues or think carefully about how to balance interest in a pluralistic democracy. No, instead, these people are causing the problem. We need to get them out of our community. And I, the demagogue, am the best position to do that. So I can save you from all of this trouble if you just let me get rid of these people.
Right. I mean, obviously, in this administration, that is undocumented immigrants in this country. Increasingly, it is trans Americans in this country. Yeah, I mean, you can even look at the campaign, and specifically with Haitian migrants in Ohio, the eating cats and dogs lie that was told multiple times by the now vice president and president. That's the scapegoating you're talking about here. I find it interesting, this idea, though, that this is an environment, the way that people who study these things, like you and other scholars, it's that it is an environment, but we often think of demagogues as these almost like mystical communication wizards who like have this ability to like reach into the minds and hearts of people and twist them or whatever, which is just kind of not the case. It is way more the, I guess, boiling frog metaphor where the pot slowly gets hot and people don't notice, and then all of a sudden you're in this thing, than it is this trance that people are put into by these speakers. Is that about right?
Yeah, I mean, I don't think that I would necessarily call it a trance. I think that I think we all participate in an environment. So one thing that those of us who are readers and citizens and audience members need to keep in mind is that we choose what kind of information we consume. And so when we gravitate towards demagogic information, that is going to influence certainly how we feel about the world around us, about our fellow citizens and community members. That makes us more vulnerable to this kind of communication. And one of the reasons that in the piece, in the conversation that I wrote, that I said, hey, it's really important for journalists to call an authoritarian leader an authoritarian, is because that's one way of combating demagoguery. If, on the other hand, we report these authoritarian or demagogic statements like, Haitian immigrants are eating the dogs, they're eating the cats. If we're saying that is, if journalist asks, are we looked into this to see if anybody was eating dogs and cats? No, it's that is a dangerous demagogic statement that needs to be labeled as such. But that the responsibility for doing that is on both the producers of news, but also those of us who are readers, because with social media, we can all opt into environments that confirm our existing beliefs and actually reinforce the beliefs that we have about other people that are sort of the worst of the worst. Or we can really stay focused on policy information and try to get the facts and try to find sources that combat misinformation. Um, well, and that's the thing. Demagoguery really appeals to something deep inside of us. Really, our desire to be in community with other humans, but also to be in communities where we are separated from people we consider others or different or dangerous. I mean, that goes way back. That developed as a survival instinct when that was the way that we could survive as humans. One of the things that has made us scientists say the dominant species on the planet is our ability to be in community with other people. And so it's a valuable and in many times constructive instinct, but it can be perverted, and demagoguery inverts that and makes it something that's really destructive and dangerous for democracy.
Right. I know. In thinking about the example of it being a trance, I realized that why that's incorrect as an idea is that it makes it sound like somebody can snap their fingers and it will go away. It's not a spell being cast that can be broken. It's not that. So how do we unsteep ourselves from this kind of demagogic environment? Because it feels like it is part and parcel to communication, to a lot of news, a lot of commentary specifically that's happening right now. Is there a way out of that?
Well, I certainly think that there is. It's not an easy way, but one of the ways is to know what our different options are as communicators. In Patricia Roberts Miller's book, she distinguishes demagogic political communication environments from deliberative communication environments. In a deliberative communication environment, the goal is not to find out who is the enemy, who do we need to get rid of. It is instead to say, we have a policy conundrum here. How do we solve that? And then to solve that by using good arguments, factually based information, things like that. So deliberative policy discourse and trying to stay focused on that is one avenue. Another avenue is put forth by scholars of dialogue. So people like Monica Guzman comes to mind, but they talk about, all right, one way that we can try to understand our fellow citizens is to be truly curious about why they hold the views that they do. She urges us not to assume that we know their motives, but instead to ask, what are your motives? What is it that you believe? And I think that there is room for curiosity, more curiosity and empathy on multiple sides of the aisle. The thing that I think makes that sometimes different or difficult is that works really well if both participants, both sides of a controversy are equally curious and equally open to learning. If, on the other hand, one side has a posture of curiosity and empathy, and the other side is continuing to be demagogic.
Right. I'm specifically thinking of the Jubilee roundtables that so many listeners will have seen on YouTube, which are the one liberal against 25 conservative college kids or whatever. Like, it's that thing. It is, and I have said this on the show, and you don't have to agree or disagree with me on this, but it was how Charlie Kirk came to be so popular. Was he would go to college campuses and have these bad faith arguments with people. It was based on a logical fallacy. I said that before. It's how people like Steven Crowder on the right. And this is specifically, I think, a phenomenon on the right, which is also, I guess, coincidentally, we'll say, or not so coincidentally, also the side that is much more demagogic at this moment in American history. And so, yeah, those things come to mind, and that these aren't good faith dialogues that people are having. And I think to have those dialogues and to do the things that you're talking about, to, I don't know, turn the temperature down is a terrible metaphor, I think, for this, but to undo some of this communication system we just don't have an equal approach to this. And I think that makes it really hard right now for people to approach even wanting to solve some of this.
I wholeheartedly agree. In fact, I was having this very conversation with my political communication students yesterday. Charlie Kirk was supposed to come to our campus next week. And we were going to have one of, the round table debates that he does, as well as a speech. And we happened to, interestingly, just also be reading Monica Guzman's book in my class this week. And so I just posed to my students, I said, okay, independent of what's being said, let's just talk about the way, the choices we could make about the way something is said. All right. And we talked about what's the communication effect, the environment created by a sort of prove me wrong scenario where it's one debater kind of performing in front of an audience of people that where he's not attempting to understand a multiplicity of views. It's really a very kind of agonistic or antagonistic environment. It's designed to speak and spark controversy and outrage in some cases. They're also.
It's not even. I was going to say it's not even an argument in which he's trying to make the better argument. In which I shouldn't just put that on Kirk. It's all those people who do that. It's a logical fallacy of forcing the other side to prove a negative, which is just not good argumentation.
So yeah, and so the point that I want to make in this case is like, okay, that's one style of communication that has a certain set of effects. Deliberation and dialogue scholars have gone on college campuses, have brought together groups of people to talk about policy issues, the same policy issues that Charlie Kirk, talked about in his discussions. All right, so both of these are ostensibly policy discussions. But if you take the dialogic approach, if you say, rather than prove me wrong, you say, I want to understand why you believe the way that you do. Tell me a story from your life that informs your view. Or let me try making one of the strategies Guzman recommends is she says, make the strongest argument you can for the other side, the side you don't agree with. All right. And that requires some perspective taking. Now, I was a college debater. In intercollegiate debate, one of the reasons why debate really, came up as something that was designed to train people to take different perspectives is that in a college debate situation, you have to debate both sides of the argument multiple times. And so you have to, the phrase is you have to steel person rather than making a straw person argument. You have to make a steel person argument on various sides of a controversy. All right. Now, the difference in some of these debate scenarios that we're seeing now is that there isn't a taking of both sides or a considering of multiple sides. It's just each side reinforcing their view in the shortest amount of time possible. And it often activates those demagogic interests. Now, I will say that we want to encourage college campuses to be environments for the free exchange of ideas. And communication is not violence. However, as a political communication scholar who studies democratic health and demagoguery, I will say that communication can be an incendiary device to kick off violence. And that's why political violence often begets more political violence. So I think we really want to ask ourselves as a society, how do we use communication to have these very difficult policy scenarios? And then secondly, how can we in a pluralistic democracy avoid scapegoating and demonization and dehumanization? And that's where I would just ask people as they're reflecting on, infamously, Ezra Klein, New York Times opinion columnist, said Charlie Kirk is doing politics the right way. Simply having a free exchange of ideas isn't enough to be doing politics the right way. The way we speak in those environments has a lot to do with, are we promoting democratic health or are we undermining it?
Is it that kind of political rhetoric and the kind of political rhetoric that we have seen certainly over the past few years, but definitely over the last, just over 8 months now. Is it that kind of rhetoric causes political violence, or is it a correlation, not a causation?
So I think in, throughout political history, we have people who are committing, particularly when it's like assassinations that we've seen now of politicians and political figures on both sides. There is usually more going on with that individual. It's usually, certainly everybody who listens to these political messages, most of us do not go out and assassinate somebody. So it is not a hypodermic needle, this causes political violence in anybody and everybody. Absolutely not. They're contributing factors. But I will say that we have, when we're talking about political violence, there are many different kinds of political violence. And I think we've seen an uptick in that. So it's not just people going in and assassinating political figures and elected officials, but other ways in which violence is being perpetrated against communities in our streets, on our TV. Then that sort of normalizes that, oh, okay, if somebody is in the country without documentation, one way we can handle that is, legally go through the steps to, get them out of the country if they're not here legally, but there's a process, there's a due process, and everybody has access to it. Or we can send unmarked vans of masked individuals without specific law enforcement credentials that they're willing to share and grab people off the street. That too is politically motivated and informed violence. So I think if we have an environment where we are seeing an uptick of all kinds of different sorts of political violence or different sorts of people's human rights or civil rights not being honored, well, then that leads to what Patricia Roberts Miller would say, a demagogic political environment. And so combating that environment, restoring the rule of law, restoring equality, equal treatment under the law, all of those things are necessary to have a healthy and safe democratic environment.
There's a thing that you said earlier about the dialogue approach to this, in that adopting the other side's perspective, even if it's just to make a steelman argument, to make your own argument better. It strikes me as this interesting thing that it's almost poetic, that itself is a way to make community with somebody else. And it's this thing that, like, if demagoguery is playing on our, caveman part of our brain that needs to be a part of a group, the way out of this is to force ourselves to be a part of a group with somebody we wouldn't normally be, which there is something sort of, I don't know, hopeful about that sentiment, which I really like. The thing that I want to get to here before I know you have to go is what you wrote in the conversation about how journalists should be talking about our current moment, this slide into authoritarianism, competitive authoritarianism, because we aren't doing a very good job of calling a spade here. And for starters, why do you think that is? And then we can go into how we could do this better. But why do you think that is right now?
Well, so for one thing, I'll say that when we talk about what is authoritarianism, like, there are criteria. And so some of the criteria that other scholars have offered is, rejecting democratic rules, denying the legitimacy of elections that when your side loses, tolerating or encouraging political violence. So if you condemn it when your side is affected by political violence, but encourage it or pardon the offenders when the other side is affected by political violence, that's a tenet of authoritarianism. And curtailing the civil liberties of your opponents in ways that you're not curtailing the civil liberties of your supporters. So all of those are characteristics of authoritarianism. Those are things that we can document and factually, verify, is this happening or not? And so I think one of the reasons that journalists are understandably hesitant to call, the current administration authoritarian is that it's really important for journalists to preserve their editorial independence and to be perceived as nonpartisan. Interestingly, the journalists who have come out and called the Trump administration authoritarian are primarily opinion journalists who do not have the same um, criteria connected to trying to be impartial, right? They want to be fact-based, but opinion journalists are supposed to tell us their opinion. Hard news journalists are supposed to just report the facts. And so saying, oh, this leader is authoritarian sounds biased, right? It doesn't sound impartial. But what I would urge, and what political scientists who study authoritarianism have urged journalists to note, is that, hey, there's a definition of authoritarianism. There's a set of criteria. If a politician's actions fit into that criteria, then actually it's incumbent upon you to let the American people know, hey, that's what this is. Because it's not necessarily going to be, shutting down all free speech or troops on the streets. I mean, we do actually have troops on the streets in some settings now. So, that's why a lot of people who study this say we've moved comfortably and credibly into a competitive authoritarian environment. I mean, we literally have troops on the streets in that where the local officials don't necessarily want them there. I will make a point with respect to the troops on the streets, and that has to do with authoritarianism, and that is that one of the reasons that we've always had a bright line between what our military does and what our law enforcement officials do is that they are trained differently. Military forces are trained to be in foreign contexts, not necessarily taught to uphold the civil liberties of U.S. citizens when they do their job, because normally that's not the job they're supposed to be doing. So with there is no shade at all to our distinguished members of the military. It's just an observation that they have a different training. And so all of that is to say, when journalists see these things happening on the ground, it really is incumbent on them to say, hey, we have an authoritarian playbook. We've seen it happen in other democratic countries in recent history. If the same thing is going on here, we've got to talk about that and consider the implications.
Mm-hmm. It took me a long time in doing this show. I mean, I have a background in hard news. I did that for more than a decade and left to do this show. And it took me a long time to get to a place in which I talked to enough people like yourself who were saying all these same things and had to be like, if all these people were economists and they were telling me that the indicators they're seeing is that we're heading for a recession, I would call it a recession. And I don't know why we should treat anybody who studies authoritarianism or competitive authoritarianism who is saying all these things, why I would treat that differently just because it feels politically biased. It's not. There are signals and signs and experts are saying these things. And if, like I said, if it were a recession, we would call it a recession and we should treat it this same way. I think it's hard for journalists to get there. I think it's hard for newsrooms to get there. I think there's a lot of access issues that would come about from that. And if you don't have access, no one's going to want your show. No one's going to read your paper. Mm-hmm. But how can we be better equipped as journalists to push back against that part of this too? Because I think a lot of people are thinking the way that I do.
It's a really fair question. And frankly, it's one that we are facing in higher education as well. We too, like journalists, are not partisan in our classrooms. We are research-based. We are describing scenarios as as our research confirms it. And we are not supposed to be partisans in our research or our teaching. We are not. And so I do understand the struggle that you are faced with. I don't want to alienate any of my students. Journalists don't want to alienate any of their readers or audience members. You mentioned access, and I think that it's important to note that in a competitive authoritarian environment, political power of whoever the authoritarian is, they use that political power to cut off access. So whether it is denying, approval to a merger of a major media corporation because they have that power, not related to the First Amendment, right? They have that power related, but they're like, oh, that's a lever that I can use to put pressure on this media organization. That lever has been used, and it has had the effect of undermining the independence of the news. Other levers that have been used, both in journalism and in academia, social media is used to call out authoritarians, call out reporters, journalists who they think are covering them, whose coverage they don't like. And then there are myriads of people who don't even have to be directly asked by the authoritarian to dox those journalists, to threaten those journalists, to make their lives, otherwise more difficult. And on college campuses, that is one thing that, although Turning Point USA has been lauded for its commitment to free speech, one thing that Turning Point did and has done for a very long time is had a professor watch list, where individual professors' information is put up on a website, and then they are called out to their administrations, to their bosses. They are sometimes doxxed. They are often, get hate mail or even threats of violence and death. And so I think that, there are journalistic norms that are good, that make it hard to call authoritarians what they are. But there are also anti-democratic actions that are seeking to constrain or punish journalists and academics who do call it like they see it, even when that's backed up completely by fact.
Right. In the final minutes here, and I know that I kind of asked this earlier, but just from a news standpoint, or even a higher education standpoint, if you want to take that route too, what are the steps out of that? What are the steps to a more solid place to be, in the case of journalists, the fourth estate, to push back against this thing? Because that's why the First Amendment, the freedom of the press, is in the First Amendment, is to be that thing. So what are the steps, even if they're small, that you think journalists should take to push back and to cement themselves in a much more pro-democracy place?
Both in journalism and in higher education, the component that has changed is that individual reporters and, in some cases, professors are not being supported by the people who own or control the outlets, who are in leadership positions in the university or who own media corporations. Watergate happened. The Washington Post, brought down the Nixon administration after it was, corruption was proven, because the owner of the Washington Post backed her journalists when they did that. And in fact, we've had, there's always been attempts for politicians who are in power to put pressure on organizations, journalistic organizations, educational organizations. The difference is the people at the top didn't cave in the past. And the reason I think that people didn't cave in the past is that the leaders weren't using all of the levers that this current administration is using. They thought they were constrained by democratic norms that said, oh, well, if I, clearly say that I'm not going to approve a merger because this paper did investigative reporting on me, I will be perceived as corrupt. And so that option is not available to me. We have a competitive authoritarian regime that has decided all of the options are available to them. And so they are putting pressure on organizations in ways that they haven't been pressured before. And unfortunately, although both the media organizations and the colleges and universities are winning in the lower courts time after time after time, which is another indicator that rules are being broken, not just norms, but democratic rules are being broken because these decisions are getting overturned and stopped in the lower courts. Even despite that, you have leaders of organizations saying, hey, this is an existential threat. I don't cave, at least in part, to this authoritarian's demands. The whole institution is going to fall apart. And so they are struggling with how to keep institutions afloat. But as a result, in many cases, they're choosing the option that they perceive as least resistance, which is to give in ways that universities and journalistic organizations have not given in the past.
Is the first step then to simply say that these things aren't normal? Not that they're wrong or we don't like them, but that this is abnormal, and that matters in itself to say.
It absolutely does, yes, to say that. And then I think there is a corollary burden for us as news consumers and citizens to say, all right, if I know what demagoguery looks like, and I know demagoguery is based on scapegoating vulnerable populations, and it's based on promoting logical fallacies or bad arguments, then if I see an outlet that is doing that, I'm going to look for one that isn't. So rewarding journalistic outlets, not just with our eyeballs, our attention, though that is important, but increasingly paying money, subscribing to a journalistic outlet that is committed to non-demagogic, fact-based reporting of all sides of the political spectrum. That's what we can do as well.
Right. Cough, cough. The Substack is $5 a month. Cough, cough. Yeah. Karrin, thank you. Thank you so much for doing this. I really appreciate it. This has been such a fun and fascinating conversation. So really, thank you.
I appreciate you. And thanks for the work that you're doing to have these longer conversations where we can really get in depth on some of these tough issues.
Thanks. Honestly, just the news with the way that it's been, if you're like me, you're looking for a way to just unwind. With Cozy Earth, you can transform your space, whatever it is, into an elevated haven where serenity and renewal intertwine effortlessly. I really like their bamboo sheets. They keep me cool, especially in these dog days of summer. And I really like their luxe robe. I'm a robe guy. I know, say what you will, but these are about as good as it gets. I'll even avoid planning things on the weekend just to spend a little bit more time in this robe. Now, Cozy Earth's products are a favorite among many celebrities. Kris Jenner praises their bamboo sheets as her nightly essential, raving about their softness and cooling comfort. And for 7 consecutive years, Oprah has included Cozy Earth on her favorite things list with free shipping on orders over $50, a 100-night sleep trial, and a 10-year warranty. Cozy Earth will bring lasting luxury and comfort into your home. Visit CozyEarth.com and use the exclusive 40% off code for Make It Make Sense, MIMS25. That's MIMS25. It's good for any purchase, and it's the best deal, and it cannot be found anywhere else but here on Make It Make Sense. Now, Make It Make Sense does get a cut of that sale, but, it keeps the show going. It puts you in some new sheets or towels, and it keeps me in my favorite robe. Again, visit CozyEarth.com and use the code MIMS25 for 40% off. Wrap the ones you love in luxury with Cozy Earth. Okay, let's get back to the show. I want to thank Karrin again for coming on the show. You can find links to her book and the rest of her work in the show notes of this episode. And that is it for this episode. Please rate and review the show on whatever podcast app you listen to it on. Like, subscribe, leave a comment below if you're a YouTube watcher. Sign up for the Make It Make Sense Substack. It is just $5 a month and really helps this show keep going, especially in the current climate we're in. I can't think of a more important time to support independent journalism than right now. And if you don't want to do that, I get it. No sweat, but please share the show to show your support on social media. It's MIMS Newspod. That's MIMS Newspod, all one word on every platform. Tag me too. It's at Granthermes on Twitter and Bluesky, and at Granthermes TV on everything else. Thank you so much for listening today. I'm Granthermes, and I'll talk to you next week.